Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And I've now switched to the slides I'm going to talk against. And let me know if you can't see them. I'm just checking that things can actually progress. Yep, that way. Perfect. And okay, I know some of you, not everybody, but thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Dr. Sabina Hulbert, and I am one of the research fellow within the research centre at NICE, National Institute for Christian Education Research. The other members of the research team were Anne Casson, who's with us today, and many of you probably know, who actually carried out all the qualitative data collection, and she, of course, was the principal investigator for the project. Dr. Mary Woolley, who's also at Canterbury Christ Church, and she carried out some in-depth analysis of the qualitative stuff from some of the sections of the interviews. And then Professor Bob Bowie, who again many of you probably know, and who oversaw, sort of the overall management of the project. What we're going to do today is to, as we were saying, speak for about 20 minutes about the main results of our study, of part of, the result of the Nexus study that concentrated on this issue of death, and then leave a good chunk, hopefully a good 40 minutes, 35, 40 minutes for discussion. But please do feel free to interrupt at any time if you think that, you want to know more, or your question is particularly pertinent and you don't want to wait, although be aware of the recording issue, as in the first 20 minutes of the presentation are recorded for sharing. The following 40 minutes of discussion will not be shared, they're just for the research team purposes. So, what do we know about children? Sort of interest and children research, previous research with children dealing with information about death. Well, we know first of all that children start having a basic understanding of the biology underpinning the concept of death at around 5 to 7 years. It's very difficult to do research with children before the age of 5. That's for the reasons really very much literature. But we know that about that age, they're actually able to start conceptualizing and understanding the concept of, death in the sense of you can't come back and the physiology of it. However, their understanding is pretty basic at this stage, and it develops into a complex, what we call multi-layer understanding, only with age, with further conversations. What children do is that later on, they actually are able to integrate a biological, sort of explanation, and a spiritual and religious understanding to make sense of death. But this bit of information is quite important because underpins really a lot of our, sort of conclusions and suggestions and further findings. What we also know is that this need to integrate and to build ever more complex understanding of the concept of death, actually, is done through engagement and conversation. And the lack of engagement is actually detrimental to this evolution of the conceptualization of death. From the point of view of parents, previous research actually revealed that a lot of parents are actually uncomfortable discussing death with children. And our results very much actually echo these, sort of pre-existing literature. And that's probably and possibly, or at least the suggestion that we have from the literature, is that, parents are afraid mostly. They keep the information that they give to children to a minimum, and they often run the risk of actually being ambiguous when it when we're dealing with the integration of biological and spiritual explanation. They're very aware, actually, of this limitation. As far as schools are concerned, previous literature actually tells us that death is very much a taboo. It's not a subject that is, formally planned as a discussion topic. It's something that arises often as a response to bereavement, children questions, but it's very much something that, again, school as well try to avoid is possible. Many teachers, like the parents, they actually don't feel they have the confidence to actually talk about death. And you'll see that our results have actually, as I said, echoed a lot of these research. But what did we do in specific? Well, our project is called Faith in the Nexus, and the term nexus, in the way we used it, referred to the connection between home, church school, and the local church community. What we were interested in doing, and you probably heard this before, if it's you've been in one of our Nexus seminars before, but anyway, is to understand the ways in which the collaboration between school, churches and the first point of contact with the children could actually help families in supporting the spiritual development of children. So we wanted to know how this collaboration, this nexus, could actually facilitate and improve the spiritual life experience of children in the home. What did we do? Well, we worked with 20 church primary schools, and they were a mixture of Church of England and Catholic primary schools across the country, good representation of rural versus urban and different geographical locations, school size. We really put a lot of effort into our sampling and stratification. And we started with a huge amount of interviews, focus group interviews, because they were the richer ways, really, of gathering a lot of information. These were carried out with 187 pupils and 267 adults. And the adults were parents, staff, local clergy, and all sorts of other stakeholders involved with the school. We then follow that up with a survey that was completed by around 1,000 participants, about 730 pupils and 272 adults. And this methodological approach, which we have followed now a number of times in NICER, is the one that we prefer, because we find that having a rich understanding of the context within which we are actually operating from a research point of view allow us then to actually construct quantitative survey tools that really capture the essence of what the qualitative element had actually initially pointed out. And some of the key questions that actually, were raised by the research is about this, the space and the time. How do we find that space and time for children, to voice their concern about death? And how can we actually, on the other hand, support the adults in, and reassure them in addressing questions about death with children? What I have here, it's just one question. So the Nexus project in itself was huge, as you can understand. And so here today, we're just looking at the aspect of death in specific, which constitute a very little part of all the sets of results we have. In the last slide of the presentation today, you actually have a link to the full Nexus report if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but you can also find it on our NICER page. So one of the questions that what we wanted to know in general is, what are the things that children ask questions about? And we asked children, parents, teachers, and so on, this question: how often, when at home, do you, as a child, ask question about? Or how often, when at home, does your child ask question about? So, we changed the root of the question depending on who it was targeted towards. And then we listed 12 topics. You find them here on the left. Let me know if they're too small to read, but I'll go through some of them in a minute. And participants had to respond from 0, none at all, to 100 all of the time. So on a sliding, sort of scale. There was no middle, sort of point answer, no unsure. So that's the only options that they have from 0 to 100. And that's something we did consciously. So there's a number of things that we can look. Oh, and these 12 topics, remember, we conducted the focus group first. So these were the things that we knew children talk about. So we didn't necessarily want to come up with new topics. We didn't want to find out what the areas of conversations were. We knew that these are the conversations that actually happen. But what we wanted to know in specific is how do they compare to each other? What proportion of time, do children and families actually think that the time is spent on at home in conversations? And the first result we want to point at is the fact that death, if you look at the orange bars, which are the answers, the average answers for all our children across year 5 and 6, is that death actually is one of the top 3, is the third, sort of top 3 most talked about topic in the home. Now, things to say is that if you're wondering which of these bars are significantly different from the others, if we just stick to the orange one, I can tell you that there is a set of the first 3 or 4, then are significantly different from the bottom 3, and then the middle ones, that are kind of in between. So there are 3 clusters roughly. So first of all, yes, that is something that children are natural, spontaneously very interested in, and that's the evidence for it in the orange bar being, sort of one of the top 3. If you look at the blue ones, you also see that, again, death, even for parents, is reported as being a very, very common topic of conversation. There's, sort of Jesus kind of, sort of shifting importance as far as parents are concerned compared to, creation, but the death still remains a very important topic. Something else to draw the attention of in this graph is the fact that all of the orange bars are shorter, sort of lower in average frequency reported than the blue ones. That's something we find consistently across the whole research. It means that either parents are keen on saying that actually the child talk about all of these things much more than the children actually realistically do, or that there is some bias there between the two. We don't really know, and we have no way of actually, from the data we have to find out. But isn't it interesting that there is always an overrating on behalf of the parents? The last things to say that you can't see from here, but I'm telling you, is that across all of the schools that we tested, we did analysis also by school, death is the only one that is consistently rated at the same level by pupils. So there is no variability with regard to how important the talking, the conversations about death are across the schools. And that's the only topic of all of these 12 that does not show that differentiation. So if we talk about, for instance, how important prayer is, or how important talking, or how often, let me put it that way, children ask questions about other faiths when in the home, that result, that sort of around 20% shift from school to school, and so do all the others. Death doesn't. So that was in itself incredibly, sort of striking and is important as a finding. So what else can we say? How is the qualitative part, sort of our data interacting and enriching this bit of information? Well, we actually, we were able to dig out information about, for instance, why do children ask questions about death? Okay, so what are the motivations? What are the context of the reasons? And clearly, curiosity is one of the main reasons. If you think about what we were saying earlier on, the way in which children make sense of death, starting with the biological and understanding, and then layering it with other ways of understanding, curiosity is the way in which, in asking questions, that actually integration takes place. So it's by asking questions about death that, that multi-layer understanding of something that ultimately, let's be honest, doesn't really make much sense, is it? Isn't as adults we struggle to really, make sense of that. And contextually, we can see that actually conversation and question about death are stimulated by discussions in RE and acts of worship. So what happens in schools very much goes home. And it's because there are things such as, for instance, sort of this quote on bottom left, "Mummy, when you die, Mummy, where will you go? And, will you go to see Jesus?" So having learned about certain issues in RE actually, sort of prompts questions about death back at home. Of course, bereavement, which would be, sort of the instinctual, the kind of intuitive, sort of explanation of why children ask about death is certainly there, not just in regards to relatives and people, but even with regards, of course, to pets. Other issues, other conversations in schools, other, sort of lessons, for instance, about concerns for others and the homeless and refugees, actually spark interest in children. Okay. Or concerns about the natural world, as highlighted in these other two quotes. Why are people dying in Africa? So when people learn, sort of about poverty and about, for instance, sort of environmental issues, they actually find out that a lot of this information is relevant because, of course, it leads to death and differences and, sort of, and so, again, it's something that keeps coming up. We probably wouldn't realize that, but, it is an underlying concept, and it's been beautiful to actually have had the ability through Anne's interviews to draw out all of these contextual, sort of incentives that children have to be interested about death.
5 minutes, Sabina.
Oh dear, already. So what helps children with their concern about death? Well, space. We found that actually these reflection, this need to integrate, difficult information needs to happen in a safe and quiet space. So the space, for instance, the children have at school to reflect, like spiritual gardens, is essential. And so, for instance, I assume that, sitting at home in front of the telly or in a busy environment doesn't help that conversation. So one of the recommendations, is that of helping children, have these protected space. What actually does the school do to stimulate questions in the home? Well, as we were saying earlier, a lot of the lessons, for instance, on worship, do stimulate those questions. So these are all, sort of positive ways of helping children conduct this conversation and clarify, their knowledge and understanding. People said that discussion in religious education often made them wonder and stimulated question at home about that, as well as, very importantly, school visit to the church, and which, for some children might be sometimes the only opportunity they have if the parents are not necessarily religious or, sort of attending church regularly. What do the parents tell us? Well, they actually tell us that they find the children's questions about death, compared to all the others, some of the most challenging, because they don't have the correct language. They actually don't know what the school has been telling children. They are afraid of contradicting what the school says. And interestingly, actually, the school says the same. The school sometimes is worried about contradicting, sort of parents' potential, sort of perspective and information. So that lack of communication is clearly an issue. And then sometimes not sharing the same Christian beliefs at the school. It's one of the reasons as to why these difficulties actually are rising. So here on the bottom left, there's a little bit of an insight. There's a need to empower adults to talk about death and stimulate thoughts with their child rather than avoiding talking about death, because it's that gap, is that void that actually is more problematic. And something that is not included, but I want to say, is actually it's not about having the right answer. So these concerns about, giving an answer, what we know is that the children are not necessarily interested in having an answer. Children are interested in having a conversation. They want to make their own sense of it, of what it means. But it's having that space for conversation that actually matters to them the most. And parents often turn to grandparents because probably they've done it before, because they have more knowledge, and because it's another perspective, or even to the church, to the school, to actually answer these questions. But they would rather leave it to others unless they actually don't, they're not basically paying down. It's very, more likely than not. So what are the key really findings to stress here? Children said that people that they were most likely to have questions about issues of life or spiritual matter are members of the close family. So children want to have the conversations with the family because they are the ones that they feel more comfortable with having this conversation. But parents often are not able to respond to these requests. Parents look to the school. So it creates this vicious circle, really, that leaves this gap. And schools often do not proactively engage in conversations about death when actually they should be, relatively well equipped and very welcome in that initiative. So certainly taking a more proactive approach is the thing to do. Exploring the questions with the children, and remember that there is, no need to have the right answer. It's just about engaging in conversation, and really for churches and schools to support the parents, in finding this language and really creating the opportunity with space and time to actually address some of these concerns. You'll see that if you read our report, and even in the video that is attached to the report, that we create four archetypes, four types of attitude towards these dealings that actually represent most type of families. So there is all sorts of ways in which family deals with it, and there is no right way of basically that's our conclusion, other than responding to their needs and creating that time and opportunity. I'll probably stop there. There's loads more, of course, that we have in terms of information and